Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Chris Rexroad, and we're looking at a passage from Acts 19. So Paul arrives in Ephesus and follows his typical pattern of ministry. So he's going to the synagogue first to reason with the Jews to accept Jesus as the Messiah. And for 3 months, he preached and taught in the synagogue. And when some of the Jews persisted in their unbelief and began to speak evil of those who believed in the gospel before the synagogue, Paul felt it was time to separate from the synagogue. So he moved to the hall of Tyrannus, which was either a lecture hall or a school. And for the next 2 years, Paul supported himself through tent making, and he taught the gospel daily in the hall of Tyrannus at the same time. This ministry was effective to the degree that the entire Lycus Valley was affected and churches were planted. Key workers such as Epaphras were birthed out of this ministry. And eventually the message of Jesus grew until even a major economic impact was felt in the area. Millions of dollars worth of sorcery books get burned, and the shrine industry was about to feel a loss of business. And so as the ministry was entering its third year, Paul received divine direction that he was to move on through Macedonia, eventually return to Jerusalem, and ultimately preach the gospel in Rome. And he made plans to follow this directive. So shortly after he knew it was time to leave, a riot broke out in Ephesus. And although the text does not indicate that the riot was the reason for him to leave, Luke represents the event as though it may have been a confirmation of the decision. It seems as if God's grace for Paul's ministry in Ephesus had reached its fulfillment. The riot is a picture of how effective the gospel had been in that area. So a regional movement had literally been created. So many people had turned to Christ and forsaken the worship of Greco-Roman gods that it had created an economic effect on the idol-making industry. A man named Demetrius led a revolt claiming that the silver shrine industry would collapse if something was not done about those who were preaching the gospel. And as the anger of the people was stirred up by this revolt, a large crowd was formed that eventually moved to the local amphitheater and filled the seats. 2 of Paul's traveling companions were pushed to the front to attempt to offer an explanation to the crowd, but the crowd shouted them down. And for 2 hours, the crowd shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Eventually, the mayor was able to diplomatically restore order, but the event confirmed that it was time for Paul to move on. So he encouraged the believers and headed toward Macedonia. During this account, though, Luke does not make Paul the subject of the narrative. Rather, he documents that the gospel message has created a movement in that area. So, Chris, the idea of the gospel movement that affects entire cities and regions sounds wonderful to modern Christians, but do you think believers are prepared for the challenges that are created for such a movement?
No, I mean, we need to prepare for things like that, but I mean, you really never know what fire is going to start in a certain area. So, like in that particular story, you know, the great concern what had to do with silversmithing and the financial aspects to that. But I mean, we should realize that there's going to be a lot of conflicts that come with it, because you're changing the way that people think and behave and what's considered moral and ethical compared to what society used to accept. And so you're going to face resistance to that, you know, and money and what people invest themselves in are going to be major players in that.
I don't think sometimes we are prepared for how the impacts, even in the local church, right? I've said this a lot of times. I think all local churches say they want to grow and they want to reach the world for Jesus, but they don't really mean it.
Yeah.
Because if you had a revival, so your building got full, most of those people would be miserable, right? They wouldn't be happy about all the changes that would come, because you can't go from 50 to 100 and not have significant changes in your church. You can't go from 100 to 300 and not have significant changes in the community that you have. You can't go from 300 to 1,000, right? So they went from 120 to 3,000 on the day of Pentecost, right?
Mhm.
That changes the dynamics of everything. And, the example I use frequently is two people can get married and their life looks one way. They can add one to it, one child,
Mhm.
changes everything.
Mhm.
What they can do, where they can go, when they go, what they've got to do to be able to go. All of those things change. Your sleep patterns change. Your money change. Everything changes, and the
Mhm.
same is true in church, right? You say you want a movement, but I would say the biggest problem with most movements is not the opposition from the outside; it's the opposition from the inside.
Oh yeah.
That's at least my experience.
We want a movement as long as they'll come in and do what we do,
Well, as long as it
and it
don't
doesn't change
change
anything.
anything.
That's right.
The reality is, if they came in and did um, everything they wanted them to do, um, they did the same thing, they're going to be uptight because it costs more money. There's more wear and tear.
Mhm.
They're sitting too close to me. They're in my seat.
They're in my
Whatever,
seat, yeah.
they're all of those things. I think the biggest problem with movements is we're not prepared for them on the inside.
Yeah.
What do you think you would have done if you had been a follower of Jesus who was pushed forward before a shouting crowd in an amphitheater and asked to address the group? How do you think you would have responded?
Did they have Depends then?
They wore robes.
Yeah.
It just went down your leg. Is that podcast appropriate, Daniel?
We got pictures from over there about their bathrooms. You can throw
yes.
that in there too.
Mm-hmm. No.
It would be incredibly intimidating, but I'd give it my best shot. I mean, if I was being forced to the front, like we talked about a day or two ago, I mean, you have to be prepared to speak and tell people what they need to hear, and we can't determine their reaction, but we should probably prepare for, like in a mob like that it could go bad real quick.
I don't know how I would respond. I'm not afraid of public speaking. I'm not afraid of an argument. But I like to pick them. Like I don't want you shoving me to the front to defend something I'm unprepared. If I'm prepared to make the argument, in this case, I should have been prepared.
Right.
Right. In this case, I should have been prepared. That's one of the things. Even I did a video recently on Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch,
Mm-hmm.
and he was led by the Spirit to go run beside the cart,
Mm-hmm.
the carriage, and he was led by the Spirit to go in and talk to him. But he had to have the answers to be able, because it says from that point he told him the gospel from where he was reading. He used that as the basis, right? So you got to prepare. It's one thing to say I want to be led by the Spirit. It's a whole nother thing to be prepared to be led by the Spirit.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother thing to say I'd stand before the mob, or are you prepared when that moment does come? Not will the Lord sustain you, but have you put in your heart and mind what you need to be able to say to be able to defend the gospel in those moments?
And to also know what really lies at the base of the argument. Were they really arguing about Jesus Christ, about Christianity, or did it have far more to do with their economics?
Yeah, right. I would agree. Sometimes Paul chooses to stay and keep preaching during a revolt. Sometimes such an event becomes this confirmation for him to go. It's time for him to move on. How do you tell the difference in our lives when we make decisions about ministry efforts, whether we should move on or stay put or keep going?
Definitely prayer and wise counsel. At least in our environment, that's usually what I encourage people to lean on. But looking at it for Paul, just kind of gauging the temperature of the people around him, the impact. Is he feeling led to move on to somewhere else? Because sometimes we can definitely feel, the Spirit leading us in a certain direction, and other times we feel like we're moving on because almost of like defeat, or like I've put everything I can into here. It doesn't seem to be making a change. I need to reallocate myself somewhere else.
It's a challenge, to know. I'm not this has been a real tension point for me over years. I'm not much of a sign person, right? I'm not always looking for a sign. I take the tack that we're led by the Spirit. We should follow the Spirit. That's kind of how I see it. But sometimes things are confirmation. Sometimes things are, I'm just not that person. I've told this story a lot of times, but Pastor Jay and I were going to Venezuela in 2015 is my recollection. 14, 15. It was in that ballpark. And my wife was out of town, and I got kidney stones, bad kidney stones. Ended up at the hospital. And this was like 2 days before we left. Oh, gosh. And I asked the doctor, what am I supposed to do? He said, I wouldn't recommend traveling. You don't want to get in a bind somewhere else. He said, but if you pass them, then it's up to you if you want to go. So Jay came by the hospital to visit me, and he said, well, this is my sign not to go to Venezuela, because he could have went on without me. And I said, well, if it was your sign, why didn't he give you kidney stones? Right? Why did I get kidney stones? And I still laugh about that today, because I don't believe it was a sign. I believe it was going to be a sign for him. The Lord would have given to him so he could talk to him, not be talking to me for him. But, we can put too much. One of my oppositions to signs, looking for confirmations, is confirmations can be given by the enemy just as good as it can be from God.
Yeah.
Now, can you pray silently? All of those things. Yes. I'm not going to have that debate. I'm just saying it can be. So I try not to make big decisions based on signs.
Right. Because we can even manipulate that.
100%.
It's I see this with people when they're dating and stuff like that. It's like, it's got to be a sign.
Right.
Because
I saw a cloud that was the face of God.
Yep.
No, you didn't. Yeah, you probably didn't.
Yeah.
You were starry-eyed from that kiss you just got, but I doubt you saw God in the clouds. I'm not saying you can't. I'm just saying you probably didn't. If we're not careful, we will minimize how Scripture told us to go about these things. The Word of God, right? That should be the first place we consult. Wise counsel is a place that we should always consult. Being led by the Spirit is a place we should always consult. We just have to be careful about signs, because we can become sign dependent and get lost really quickly.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's my 2 cents. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we finish up our conversation this week on Acts.